Welcome, fellow citizens of YouTube. I am Based, and today we are gonna talk about my crazy sounding but sensible theory about Ukraine's real offensive. I will offer you an explanation to why Ukraine's offensive is going so badly, and a plan B for Ukraine to put a lot of pressure on Putin. A theory that would explain a lot of recent happenings. And if you follow my channel for some time, then you know that I don't just say anything without great thought behind it. And if I do, then I always remark that. So, my theory is that the real Ukrainian offensive won't happen in Zaporozhye as it's happening right now, where it has been expected for months by the Russians and everyone else, which is a very fortified area now with established logistics and everything prepared to crush any Ukrainian advance, just like the Germans got crushed in Operation Citadel, where the Russians knew they were gonna attack beforehand, like 3 months beforehand, and could prepare minefields, trenches, everything. And the Russians have prepared a lot of minefields in this area, and as we've seen, the Ukrainian Bradleys, Leopards, etc. destroyed, they were destroyed by minefields mainly. So they didn't even see any Russian tanks. They couldn't even use their superior technology to fight Russian tanks and completely obliterate them. They got obliterated by mines before they even got there, just like the Tigers and the Panthers in Operation Citadel. But I've seen nobody on YouTube or anywhere else offering another sensible plan for the Ukrainians. So let's get to the possibilities for Ukraine. Okay, so the possibilities for Ukraine to attack inside of Ukraine are first to attack Zaporozhye like they're doing right now, which is very expected, and get decimated in open fields with fortified positions of the Russians and prepared Ruskies everywhere. Perfect for Russian artillery and aviation to destroy Ukrainian forces advancing in mass, because there's not a lot of cover here, there are pretty much no forests here, and the forests that exist here, they are like little foresty lines that you can't really hide lots of troops in. And then you know exactly where they are, and you can destroy them with aviation and artillery, which the Russians are really good at. The only possibility for Ukraine are small tactical offensives, just like the Allies did at the end of World War I, the so-called bite and hold tactic. But this strategy is very long-term focused, and in long term the Russians have the advantage due to being a much bigger country and having much larger resources. You can see this tactic actually being used by the Ukrainians, as the Ukrainians capture one town, then move on to the other, then move on to the next, like here, here, and here. This is the bite and hold. The other possibility is for Ukraine to attack in the Donbass, so this area here. And they're doing this a little bit. They're attacking in Bakhmut here, but they're attacking Bakhmut for different reasons. But yeah, an offensive deep into the Donbass territory would be very stupid, and I'm gonna explain you why. Both Luhansk and Donetsk wouldn't destroy the Russian army in any way, losing it, I mean. It would embarrass the Russians, but Donetsk is very fortified and defendable against any offensive, so bad target. Because Donetsk here, this area has been fortified since 2014, and the people that live here are very, very, very hostile towards Ukraine. And the area here is very city-like. You see like Holivka, Makivka, Donetsk, Alchevsk, Luhansk, pretty decently sized. Actually, Donetsk is a very, very big city. You know, there are no cities in the vicinity as big as those cities. So you've seen how difficult it is for both sides to capture a city the size of Bakhmut. But then look at the cities the size of Donetsk. Donetsk is huge. It's more than a million people city. But they could attack Luhansk here, as Luhansk doesn't have so many big cities. And Luhansk is, you know, not that fortified by the Russians. The Russians haven't put that much effort into defending Luhansk here, but for good reason, because Luhansk is not that useful. Ukraine could capture a lot of territory here, where they wouldn't cut off Crimea or anything, and they would just wait for the Russians to grind them down with artillery and aviation, and get encircled from this side and this side, so attacking here doesn't really accomplish anything. So it doesn't really make any sense. Then there's the possibility of Ukraine not really attacking at all. Maybe small tactical attacks, but not really attacking big time and losing a lot of forces, but preserving them and defending and letting the Russians destroy themselves. Pretty much what they did in Bakhmut, and the Russians suffered heavy losses, but this depends on the stupidity of the Russians, and I don't see the Russians falling into such a trap, and even if they do, then it's not certain that high losses will eventually destroy the Russians, as Russia has proven historically extremely resilient to losses. And that's a very passive strategy, where they let Russia essentially decide their own fate, and you don't really want to do that. The Ukrainians want to have the power in their own hands. So now, capturing back any territory inside of Ukraine seems like a bad idea, and Ukraine has already captured back a lot of territory last year in Kherson and Kharkov, which embarrassed the Russians but didn't really break them in any way. Here you can see the Ukrainians captured a huge chunk, and here too, and that was very embarrassing for the Russians, but it didn't break the Russians. So if the Ukrainians capture back this chunk, would do the same thing as here, would be pretty embarrassing. Then the Russians say, oh yeah, we retreated, blah 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 blah, and the war would drag on for years and years and years, and in the end the Russians would probably win because they have more resources than the Ukrainians, because in year-long wars the side with more resources wins. But there's another way that's way scarier for the Russians, which nobody expects: attacking into Russia proper, towards Moscow or somewhere else, or just capturing the border regions of Belgorod, Bryansk and Kursk. And I will tell you why this would be a very risky but possibly the most promising way for the Ukrainians to win this war. The first reason is Putin has to end the war very quickly. The longer Ukrainian troops stay on Russian soil, the more people will turn against Putin to end this suffering, and people will lose their confidence in their leader and government being able to protect them from the Ukrainians. And this leaves Putin only two possibilities: either end the war quickly with a negotiation that largely favors Ukraine, or escalate with nuclear weapons, with a huge mobilization, whatever, which are all very risky alternatives, as using nukes, for example, could cause Europe or the whole world to turn against Russia and would, put Russia in a very bad situation, even if the Russians destroy the Ukrainian army with nukes, which doesn't work that easily, especially because Russia would have to use nukes on its own territory to destroy the Ukrainian army. So yeah, Russia would nuke its own territory, would nuke its own people. Very hard to destroy the whole Ukrainian army with nukes. I mean, nukes are scary, but you would have to nuke a huge area to accomplish that. And everybody would be against Russia. So this possibility would just cause Russia to shoot itself in the leg. The other possibility would be a huge mobilization and counteroffensive against the Ukrainian forces inside of Russia. And this huge mobilization and everything could cause that much civil unrest that Putin would get toppled and the Ukrainians win in the end. Then there's, of course, the thing that Russia would have to move its troops away from the front, making it way easier for Ukrainian troops to capture back the lost Ukrainian territory, Zaporozhye, Kherson, Luhansk and Donetsk, as the Russians stormed towards Moscow to try to save, Russia proper. Especially because Russia is not prepared for an offensive in this area, and surprise is super important. Because if the enemy hasn't drawn up real plans for how to handle the situation, they have to come up with it on the spot, which makes it much worse to handle such a situation. And especially there are no Russian fortifications in this area to really hold back the Ukrainians. There are not many open fields in this area, so way better cover for Ukrainian infantry, which is perfect for their drop off 50 infantry and go back, get another and drop off another 50 infantry tactic. They used this tactic in Kharkov, which they still tried to use in Zaporozhye, but in Zaporozhye they failed because the front is too covered by Russian troops, and there's not much cover for infantry to hide in. And if you bring infantry somewhere and go get another batch of infantry, the infantry has to hide somewhere. In the best case in the woods, or in the city, or in the village. And this worked very, very well in Kharkov, because there are many woods in this area. Kharkov is right next to Belgorod, and there are just as many woods, where this strategy worked extremely well. And tons of Ukrainians, hundreds or thousands of Ukrainian infantrymen got behind the Russian lines, could destroy Russian equipment and wreak havoc. So infantry in the woods of Bryansk would be pretty much impossible to accurately hit, because you don't really know where exactly they are. Because you can't see into the woods, obviously, because of the trees. In Zaporozhye, as I've shown you, it's either open fields, so you can see him and destroy him, or it's very small wooded areas where you can just shell the whole wooded area easily and destroy the Ukrainians in there or make them flee. But if they're in a big wooded area, you can't cover a decently sized wooded area with artillery, so there's always places to hide there, and you can never really get all of the infantry out of there. And there's also not enough Russians covering the front, as we saw in Bryansk and Belgorod, because Ukrainian raids rolled through there without any resistance, and the Russians only pushed them back hours afterwards. So the Russians there work with quick response forces that need some time to get there, and if the Ukrainians really attack with mass, with a huge force, then those quick response forces would be way too late and met with too much force, and then the Russian response would take days. So that would give the Ukrainians a lot of time, as the Russians are not really covering the front. Which makes a similar situation as in the Kharkov offensive last September, where Ukraine captured huge amount of territory in a few days with a much worse equipped army than they have now. They didn't have strikers back then, they didn't have Leopards, they only had like Soviet equipment, and they accomplished that with Humvees mostly. With driving up with Humvees, dropping the infantry into the woods and getting behind the Russian lines. Bryansk and Belgorod are full of forests for the Ukrainians to hide in and destroy any swift Russian counterattack and evade the powerful Russian artillery and aviation. And if Russia actually breaks, then Ukraine can take Russia's place as the leader of the East Slavic world, making Ukraine unbelievably powerful for decades to come. So yeah, it's a high-risk tactic, but if it actually works and Russia breaks down and there's a revolution in Russia, then it's a huge reward for Ukraine. And there are a lot of irredentists in the Ukrainian lines that have clearly stated that they really would like this to happen. And the thing is, Russia, you can't really conquer Russia, as we've seen in history. Napoleon didn't do it, the Germans in World War I didn't do it, the Germans in World War II didn't do it. You can't really conquer Russia. But if you cause a revolution in Russia, then Russia breaks, and then you can put your terms on the weakened Russian state. And now I'm gonna come up with the evidence they're actually planning this, or they could be planning this, or they could be having this in mind as a plan B if Zaporozhye doesn't work. Of course, Zaporozhye is the more easy and less risky and less escalating alternative, and probably both sides want Zaporozhye as a battleground way more. But if the Ukrainian general staff doesn't have a plan B if Zaporozhye doesn't work, then they're pretty stupid. But we've seen that they aren't stupid. Actually, they've been, faring pretty well. So they probably have some plan B, and maybe this is the one. So the evidence they're actually planning this are, of course, the Belgorod raids of the Russian troops serving under Ukrainian banner. And even those Russian troops are claiming they want to go to Moscow and topple the Russian government. So Ukraine is the perfect guys for that, to replace the Russian government. Those Belgorod raids could have the purpose of testing the defenses of the Russians and getting the Russian inland divisions, those around Belgorod, Kursk, Moscow, etc., getting those divisions closer to the border, to Ukraine, and then when Ukraine attacks en masse, Ukraine can quickly encircle those forces, and then those forces are no longer available to build a defensive line further inland to hold off the Ukrainians, so Ukraine can, free roam into Russia, as those forces are trapped in Belgorod. But I will further talk about that in the battle plan section in a few minutes. Another piece of evidence for my theory is that Ukraine is not even using half their force in Zaporozhye, and by now they should be using way more force if this was the real offensive, so it's kind of weird. But they've only lost a few high-tech equipments, probably only to test them, how they fare in offensive situations. They've only lost a few Leopards and a few Bradleys. They haven't lost that much. And they haven't used that much high-tech equipment, which they would use, certainly, as a spearhead in the real offensive. So, Plan A is probably the Zaporozhye offensive, but if it doesn't work, there's no other choice for Ukraine. And just like they talked for months about attacking Kherson, maybe you can remember last year, around this time, they talked since like April or May, Ukraine talked about capturing back Kherson from the Russians. And they didn't do it all of the time. They just didn't start. And then, when the Ukrainians actually started doing it, they first started making a lot of losses and not really capturing a lot of territory. And people laughed at them and thought their offensive wasn't working. Then the Russians moved a lot of troops into Kherson to defend against the Ukrainians and crush the Ukrainians, as the world was laughing at Ukraine. And then Ukraine launched the real offensive, attacking in Kharkov, way up in the north, at the opposite side of Kherson. And I talked about that, about the tactics they used, with those Humvees moving between the Russian lines, because Kharkov wasn't properly manned. The front wasn't covered by Russians, so you could just move between the Russian lines and encircle them and drop off infantry everywhere because there were woods everywhere. And all of the Russian troops, or the main part of them, were in Kherson. And that's how Ukraine captured a huge amount of territory in a few days. And this is exactly the same situation. For months they talked about attacking Kherson and then attacked Kharkov, which was the easier target. Now, for months they've been talking about attacking Zaporozhye. Now they're attacking Zaporozhye, but only on smaller scale, seeming like they're losing big time. And maybe then, when the Russians move most of their troops into Zaporozhye to crush the Ukrainians and maybe start something, the Ukrainians will actually attack into Belgorod and proper Russia, which isn't really covered with Russian troops, and do the same thing they did in Kharkov. Pretty much the same scenario, but with way bigger stakes at hand. And also talking about Ukraine not even using half their force, we've only seen 2 of 8 Western trained brigades being used by Ukraine in this offensive. And those brigades haven't been destroyed. So the Ukrainians have still a lot of Western trained, let's say elite troopers as reserves. And a lot of other units. Of course, the Ukrainians have a lot of brigades from back then, which are super combat experienced, which were offensive several times, and were successful in that. And now we're gonna get to something like a possible battle plan. Of course, this is the part where I didn't really, go into deep thinking about it. This is just a rough representation of what it could look like. But now I didn't have the time to really put up a huge thought through map, because I have to go now. So I've made a little map here, very rough. As the Ukrainians attack here, the Russians will be pinned down here and move a lot of troops there. When there are a lot of troops in this area and the Russians are distracted, the Ukrainians will launch their offensive here. And because the Belgorod raids have lured a lot of Russian troops, a few divisions maybe, and whatever the Russians sent there into this area, Ukraine can quickly push up there and encircle them. That's what I meant. And then the Ukrainians have free roam in this area. And the Ukrainians have shown that they're able to redeploy a lot of troops at night where the Russians can't see them to another front, here in Kharkov. They deployed, like overnight, tens of thousands of troops to this front and suddenly attacked, and the Russians were completely overwhelmed. They can do the same thing again, especially as there are a lot of troops of Ukraine in this area instantly ready to launch such an offensive, especially if they're, if they get reinforcements by troops from this area coming here overnight. Then, as you can see, they attack into Russia, and Russia has its troops concentrated here on the Ukrainian border in Belarus, and of course here in Ukraine. And those, troops have to move up from here and here while the Ukrainians are advancing in the middle, and the Ukrainians have a perfect opportunity to launch a spearhead towards Moscow while those troops are trying to catch up. But the thing is, they don't even have to capture Moscow. All they need to capture is like here Bryansk, Oryol, Kursk, Belgorod's border regions. That would be huge trouble for Russia already. And the Ukrainians could capture this area at least in such a short time, because the Ukrainians have captured this in essentially 4 to 5 days. So they can capture this with the equipment and experience they have now, let's say in 4 to 5 days, if it all goes very, very well. And then they already have a very well established spearhead here when the Russians are only starting to arrive in bigger numbers. And then, of course, we don't know really how strong the Ukrainians are, because they didn't really use their full force in this area. This is nothing pretty much they used in this area. And it wasn't really successful what they used in this area. But maybe the Ukrainians are way stronger than we think. Was the case last year. And maybe it's the case. And just so you know, I'm not like a pro-Ukrainian coper trying to find ways for Ukraine to still save this or whatever. I don't really, I'm not really for any side in this war. I'm pretty neutral. I'm just speculating here. And as they're doing this, Russia will move a lot of their troops from this area towards Russia proper to save this. And this will make the Russian positions in this area undermanned, and will make it possible for the Ukrainians to also launch minor offensives into Zaporozhye or anywhere else. But this is the most important part. Maybe another possibility is that this wouldn't be the main attack. They would just go a little bit deeper into Belgorod, so the Russians start shitting themselves, send all their troops here, and then actually launch their offensive in Zaporozhye. Maybe, but whatever. Who knows? I don't know certainly. So, yeah. I think this was it for today. A little bit cramped today. I didn't have that much time. I really wanted to make this a special video, but I didn't have enough time to do that. I hope it's still good enough, and I hope you're having a great day. This war is getting very interesting. Based out.